I'm Eli Goodman, proprietor of the Cosmopolitan Bookshop.
How long have you been in business, Eli?
50 plus years.
And you've been on Melrose?
Melrose since 1971.
And did you serve an apprenticeship with another bookseller? Or?
No, I did try to get a job at the Pickwick Bookshop, and he more or less indicated I was overqualified to be a clerk.
Who was running Pickwick at that time?
That was the renowned Lou Epstein, right?
You've known a lot of the other old booksellers from years past.
Oh yeah, I've met them. There was a Larson who had the Metaphysical Occult Bookshop on Hollywood Boulevard. There was Reynolds, had art books. You know, the names are escaping me in my old age.
Well, I was thinking of some of the names might have been like Peggy Christian.
Peggy Christian, of course. I took over her store when I moved in on Western Avenue. I moved in the stores that she left and moved into a store on Santa Monica. I took over her store on Western.
This was around
1958. I found a partner, a former book scout, who I relied on for just about everything, since I knew nothing about business, didn't know what a lease was, didn't know from nothing. And he didn't know much more, but we lasted for 6 months and parted ways after 6 months.
I see. So then you became the sole proprietor?
And I became the sole proprietor.
How did you happen on the name of Cosmopolitan?
That's an interesting question. There was a store in New York called the Metropolitan Bookshop that I loved. It was on 23rd Street, opposite the Metropolitan Insurance Company. Small store, but it had a terrific selection of remainders. I didn't know what remainders were at the time, but all I know, there were all these interesting books, and they were on tables like 49 cents, 69 cents, 89 cents. On the walls, there might be books over $1. I went for the 49, of course, with my buck, and bought books regularly there. So when it came time to name the store, I was going to call it Metropolitan Bookshop. Somebody said, it's not a good idea. You'll be confused with the other shop. So I decided on Cosmopolitan, which it's been ever since.
Did you have any background in books or book selling?
I was a book scrounger for all my life because my father was a bookman of every ilk. He had a bookstore, he published his own books, he sold his own books, he edited part of a newspaper, he wrote articles, movie criticism, theater criticism. He did everything on the newspaper. And so there were thousands of books in the house. Every place I turned there were books.
Yes.
Mostly not in English.
But
Russian, German, Yiddish, and two books in English that I found. One was Bamba the Jungle Boy. I don't know how that got in there. And the other was an Italian Pinocchio that fascinated me. And I take it back, there was a third book. There was a satire of the Bible. I didn't know what it was, but it had weird pictures showing Samson getting his head decapitated. It was a strange book, and it used to fascinate me. Those were the 3 books.
So you grew up surrounded by
books.
Yes. Did you study literature or anything like that while you were in college?
Not particularly, though I was constantly reading. I love to read book reviews, and I loved things like poetry and essays that I would read, short things. I had trouble with my eyes, and but my major studies were not literature, mostly psychology.
I think at one time you had mentioned that you had an interesting poetry class. Do you remember?
With the renowned Padraig Colum, the Irish playwright, who somehow ended up teaching a course in poetry at City College of New York. And I took it, of course, and fell in love with the guy. He was extraordinary. He was like a little Irish pixie, I mean, with that brogue, and he had a very what's the word, to offbeat manner, just very playful, very low-keyed, and he loved to read poetry. So I remember reading a poem by Shelley, To a Skylark. I've never forgotten that poem. It just rings in my ears. I can't imitate the way he read it, but and that was about it when it came to lit. No, I took a course in advanced composition. At one point I thought of doing some writing, and that talked me out of it.
But your brother became a writer.
Well, he was a writer from the very beginning. He, as a kid...
Your brother was...
Ezra Goodman, the one and only, former editor, cinema editor at Time magazine, and then cinema entertainment correspondent on the West Coast, and wrote the wonderful book called 50-Year Decline and Fall of Hollywood, plus a couple other books. Yeah, he was a big influence on me, not to become a writer, because he was so brilliant, and my father. So I figured, I'll just sell the books if I can. I won't write them.
Your father also wrote poetry, did he not?
And he wrote poetry.
Yes.
He told me that in Russia, he would take the little rowboat. They lived on the edge of a river in White Russia. And I remember him telling me the story that he would take the rowboat, the little boat, out into the middle of the river, and he'd sit there writing poetry. He was a very literary person, shall we say, into everything, every kind of writing.
But you yourself never...
Oh, I tried my hand at writing little things, and he would then publish them in the newspaper and get me all out of gear, you know. And I stopped writing. No more writing.
So instead you ended up writing herd over tens and hundreds of thousands.
There you go, writing herd. Very good, very good.
Yes, yes.
Exactly.
Your stock is, how would you characterize it?
Multitudinous. I've often thought of myself not as a bookseller, but as a book hoarder.
Among all these books, did you have any particular preferences in terms of your own personal reading? Or?
Oh yeah, poetry, essays, belles lettres, whatever that means. And since I have a hard time sustained reading, my eyes are a problem, I preferred things I could finish in a short time.
I think you had once indicated that Dylan Thomas was also a favorite of yours.
Dylan Thomas, yeah, I've memorized some of his poetry, and in moments of, in low moments, I will rehearse Dylan Thomas.
Could you give us an impromptu reading of perhaps a few lines from Thomas?
Well, there's a famous poet called it's called by the first line. The force that through the green fuse drives the flower, drives my green age. That blasts the roots of trees is my destroyer. And I am dumb to tell the crooked rose my youth is bent by the same wintry fever. And it goes on. So it's a wonderful poem.
Have you encountered on a first-hand basis any authors that you may have read in the past?
Well, one of my favorites was Aldous Huxley. Came in one day on Western Avenue, and I didn't know who it was, except I heard a lady that he came in with, addressing him Mr. Huxley. So it occurred to me, this may be Aldous Huxley. So I took a closer look, and he was holding a book like 3 inches from his eyes, and I remembered he was nearly blind. So I walked up and I said, Mr. Huxley, Mr. Aldous Huxley, may I shake your hand? And that's all I did. I shook his hand. And then she explained to me what happened. Their house had burned, destroying the library, and he was desperately trying to replace some books. And he died not too long thereafter. That's possibly my favorite. And Will Durant, one of my favorite heroes, came in. Actually, he didn't come into the store. I was in the front of the store, and I see this man standing in front of the store who looked bereft. So I looked closer, and stepped out of the store, and he says, may I presume to have you call a taxi? I'm not feeling well, or something like that. It turned out to be Will Durant. And I did the same thing. I shook his hand too and called a taxi. Those were the two people that I admired, you might say. There were other people, but entertainment figures and so on.
Was this your decision to have a broad range of inventory, or just sort of happened?
I always had a tendency to, what is the expression? Spread my risk. Whatever I did, I wanted, like if I bought a certain food, I would feel that I better buy another brand too in case this one is going to poison me. So with books, the same thing. I figured if these books that I like don't sell, have some other books. Have some cheap books, have some good books, have some paper books, this kind, you name it. And it seems to have stood me in good stead. That ploy of having a wide-ranging store seems to have worked until about 10 years ago or so, the internet struck, and whatever else concomitantly affected the book business, and business started to plummet to the point where it's almost not a business any longer. Yeah.
Were you able to use the internet to your benefit?
I have been using the internet, and it is helpful, but I don't consider that the book business. That is mail ordering merchandise, and your constant concern is the price. You've got to check the price to keep it competitive. And books on the internet are selling for any kind of non-competitive price, for a penny.
Making it very difficult for somebody who's running a retail operation.
Exactly. Back in '67, a compatriot book dealer, Kenneth Heyer, and I had an idea that we would put out a series of price guides to various important subjects in the book trade. And the first one we picked on was the occult. So for over a year, we corralled sources from catalogs, books, and whatever, and collated them into one list of over 8,000 listings, and put it in book form so it can easily be referred to with reference to each price has its individual source indicated.
And this became a kind of standard reference book for...
Well, I don't know of any other. That's one reason we did this, is because we couldn't find any other comparable work.
So it was initially for your own edification and convenience?
In a sense.
Mm-hmm. And it's still being used to this day, isn't it?
I assume that people are using it. We actually converted some of the sheets that were sitting at the printer. We converted into paperback, and the same book in paperback, and sold those. But they're no longer available from the publisher.
And it's the kind of thing that would have been used mainly by institutions and things like that.
I would think, or collectors, could be collectors too.
And this was done in the days prior to computers.
Exactly. 1967 is the date of the book, right?
And how did you go about getting your information together?
I wrote to every dealer that I could find that had any specialty in occult or metaphysical. I even phoned some. For example, I wrote to some in England, and I made personal contact with like philosophical research in LA. I talked to Mr. Manley Hall, and he was very helpful. And that were the main sources. So in the back of the book are a list of the sources, and it looks like maybe close to 100 sources were used.
You use dealers' catalogs and things of that.
Right,
Also, yeah.
catalogs, lists.
How long did this project take?
It took over a year. We, Ken Heyer and I used to get together every Sunday, almost every Sunday, and work for hours collating the entries. And if we had not edited the entries, it would have been a much bigger book. So we condensed, which was a job, making sure we didn't leave out anything that was critical.
Would you consider updating it to bring the prices into the 21st century?
I'll let some other person do that.